Two men fought. The knight was defeated by the man in black. As the knight fell to the bottom, to the unfortunate men like him, he managed to shout to his tormentor that he was mad. People screamed despot, demon, but the man in black only looked at them with his red gaze and thought that they could come up with more interesting nicknames. The demon sat on a mountain of defeated men. The knights were surrendering and the defeated fell. The man in black armor looked directly at everyone with his black eyes. He grinned and said, "Couldn't you think of anything cooler?" But suddenly he was shouted at. He was very surprised to hear Wan Yuan. He was standing on a mountain of defeated and thought that it had been a very long time since anyone had called him that. Wan Yuan grinned and began to remember who could have called him that. It could only be a golden-haired knight on a white horse, in shining white armor. The paladin of the Jin Yaoan sacred temple had asked him to stop many times. Wang Yuan was surprised by such a request from Yaoan. The latter was very courteous. Wan Yuan became embarrassed and said, "If you hadn't saved me last time, a terrible thing would have happened." The man grinned and said, "Without your help, I wouldn't have destroyed all those knights." The paladin was very angry. He looked at Wan Yuan with hatred. Wan grinned and offered the paladin to fight him, taking out his red sword. His red eyes glittered. The sword was blazing with fire. He promised that he would never stop. Wan Yuan began to release fire from his sword. The flames almost completely surrounded his figure. His body changed. He transformed into a powerful final boss of the entire Acetel continent. He no longer looked like a human anymore. His eyes lost their former appearance and blazed with fire. He soared into the sky and flashes of white power were sent out from his body in all directions. Even before the Great War began, there were dragons flying in the world, and there were huge blue giants. There was a beautiful continent called Uranus, with marvelous nature and buildings. The sacred temple was made of white stone. It was majestic and powerful. When Wan Yuan opened his eyes, he saw a light at the end of a long tunnel. He marveled at the world he could see for the first time. It was real. Wang Yuan raised his hand to the light and looked closely at it, looking at his long black fingers. He was sitting on a throne in the guise of a boss, and understood where he was and what he needed to do. He stood up from the throne, light pouring into the hall from the large windows. He knew this was the place of Uranus. Wan Yuan turned his back to the throne. His white hair was developing. The majestic and terrifying king of Uranus stood before us. He walked towards the direction from the palace. The powerful and mighty guards met him in a bow. Wan Yuan walked on a red carpet, on his way to the long staircase. Wan Yuan looked at his subjects. He was covered in black armor. He and his subjects were locked in the palace, waiting for the players. This was their destiny. Wan Yuan looked at us. His hair was developing. A fire key was burning on his chest. Suddenly, a red pop-up window appeared in front of him, with the inscription, "Not a bad start." When the king saw it, he was angry. He didn't know what it was. It changed. Now it said, "I am the mastermind behind this game, your mentor." The king scrunched up his face in surprise. He thought it was a good joke. He waved away the red window and thought that a king like him didn't need any hints. But the red window kept up with the king. It was determined to prove to him that it had power. Behind the king, the red window was glowing brightly. It was about to burst. The king yelled at the window and didn't realize what was happening. Abruptly, everything was colored red. The head boss didn't realize what was happening. The red window was trying to open his eyes. Everything shone around him. Bright light was pouring in from everywhere. The red window was shouting that the learning mode had started. The learning process could cause dire consequences. Red glares flew around the king. The king screamed and didn't realize what was happening. The red rays passed through his body, through and through. Once in the electronic space, the king heard from all sides that he was in a VR game, that this was an unreal world. Numbers and information surrounded him. A red window was downloading information into his brain. He was learning more and more about the games. He was surrounded by electricity. He was all filled with information. Even graphs appeared in his eyes. When it was over, we saw the king sitting on the ground. His brain was overloaded. There was smoke coming out of his head. The red window kept talking. The tired king decided to start asking questions. So there were two worlds and there was a colossal difference between them. The king thought about how his whole world was just lines of code, and he himself was just numbers. But the window changed his mind. The king was a very important part of this system. The window showed him how important. The king looked at it all and smiled. Numbers and videos flashed past him. King was so excited about it and was looking forward to meeting the players. But the window warned him that there was a problem. The window replied that this most important problem in the game was the king himself. The king, hearing the answer, got angry and clenched his hands into a fist. How dare the window laugh at him? The window told him that because the king hadn't woken up for a long time, the players couldn't get into the game. The king couldn't find anything to answer. The king questioned the developer, but since he woke up and now players will be able to enter the game safely, it turned out that there were still tasks that only the king could do, as he possessed reason and free will. The king was flattered by this response. He became embarrassed and was glad he was special. The window asked the king to perform small tasks. For example, move a huge rock, which the king did. The king was also required to rebuild 4 statues. Taking a hammer, he set to work. Sitting with the royal lion, the king growled menacingly as the program required him to do. Pressing various keys, the king had to check all the non-player characters were working. The king collapsed from fatigue as it obeyed the window's commands without fail. At the same time, it still required him to practice frequently. The king abruptly recoiled as he was told he had crushed a flower. But the window itself repaired the crushed flower, and even created 2 flowers in its place. The king saw how the window had changed everything with the help of a code. Then he began to ask him about the power of this program code. The king roared with rage when he realized that the window was just mocking him. After all, with the code, it was possible to do all these things he had been doing for so long. Suddenly, sparks flashed in the sky, and the heavens opened up, revealing a huge hole in the sky. Streams of energy came out of the blue hole. It was astonishingly powerful. It was a portal. The king looked at the portal and marveled. He froze in anticipation of the players. Looking straight up at the sky, the king could hear the system booting up. It wouldn't be long before hundreds of players would enter his world. And then through the portal, people came pouring in. There were women and men, knights, warriors, mages, sorcerers. The king was jumping up and down and greeting all the players. On his continent of Uranus, a city appeared before the people in all its splendor. Many beautiful buildings, the majestic nature. There were those who were very happy and admired the area. And there were those who were immediately dissatisfied and even wanted to file a complaint. People have been waiting for years for this game. Checked all the features and functions. A lot of people were happy with the welcome gifts. Some have already started to call a team for joint fights. People were choosing their roles, characters, and features. People were running to meet new adventures. Someone in the square declared that he was sorry that such a world was impossible in reality. People ran after hearing interesting news and scary statements. Men were discussing who would like a game where all people are real and something can happen to them. A man intimated to his companion that there were some changes in the game. He said ominously that there were ghosts in the game. His companion got scared and screamed. They talked about how the artificial intelligence had become the very ghost. The king glared angrily and trembled with rage. His eyes narrowed. He was breaking through the defenses, screaming and furiously trying to reach the system. He didn't understand why he couldn't greet the players. The window said that the final boss couldn't show himself to the players, since he is strong and powerful, and his health level is higher than most players. Players would run away from him in fear as their power level was dozens of times less. The king turned white with indignation. He froze and didn't understand how this all worked. Clenched his hand into a fist and shed a stingy male tear. The king really regretted that he was so powerful. But the developer had given him a chance, saying that there was a way out. After all, you can always become a different person. The king has a special mission, a very important one, to pretend to be another player. The king was excited about this opportunity. In history and literature, people have a tendency to think that the closest friend is suddenly the main villain. Imagine their surprise. The king talked to the system. He was willing to pretend a little. When he heard the system's suggestion to remove the heart, suddenly there was silence. You could hear the birds flying away. The king froze in surprise. He stood silent for a long time. He pondered the thought. He spoke to the window. Would he have to give up his heart? Only by removing the heart from his chest could he become a player, as it was an important part of the game system. With his hand on his chest, the king wondered if he could really do it. The king watched the pop-up windows. The program promised that it wouldn't hurt, but it might not be as interesting to play the game. The king scratched the back of his head and thought. His white hair ruffled. The king thought again. After all, he is the strongest and most powerful character in this game. Wouldn't he be able to handle the game without such an unnecessary thing? All that was required to agree was to place his hand on the pop-up window. The silhouette of the king's hand was illuminated on the red surface. The king slowly extended his hand towards the screen. A key began to light up on his chest. An amulet burst from his chest. A red ruby sparkled brightly there. The heart disappeared. An emptiness was left in his chest. The king screamed in surprise. Next to the king, windows popped up that told how much strength, agility, health, and luck he had. The numbers were the largest. A key symbol appeared on the red screen. Apparently, the king's heart had disappeared there. The king's appearance was changing. The crown and armor shattered. The inhuman face was replaced by a young man. A human body appeared. The king's shell was disappearing, barely revealing a young dark-haired youth. Just like that, a handsome young man appeared. The only thing that distinguished him from an ordinary man were his red eyes and long black hair gathered in a ponytail. He stood next to a tree. Droplets of sweat were dripping down his face. The king was without armor or weapons. A blue tattoo was visible on his face next to his eye. The king stood leaning against a tree. The system congratulated him on his new body and rank, but it immediately informed him that from now on, the game would change. It would no longer be the same. Everything around him began to change. There was a warning that the game would change course. Everything around the king turned red. The notices of the game swirled around the king. There were so many of them that they covered everything around him. Various windows popped up. Program codes were visible, but in the center was the king's heart. Warnings. Many warnings that the world would be destroyed. Someone had invaded the game's core. The security system had failed to stop the invasion. The reset of the core had failed. The king stood there not realizing what was happening. Suddenly, warning windows started popping up. Thousands of windows warned the king something had gone wrong. One phrase was written everywhere. The world is about to collapse. 1,000 windows surrounded the king. He screamed and didn't understand what had happened. He questioned who had invaded the game's system, why there were error windows everywhere, and what destruction awaited them. It didn't take long to get answers. Very soon the king saw the answers to his questions. Suddenly the king saw something terrible that made him furious and horrified. Behind all these notices was a real nightmare. The world he knew and loved suddenly began to crumble. His world began to crumble. Huge red pillars of flame were destroying the land he knew. Fields, forests, rivers, palaces, everything was enveloped in red flames. It was impossible to look at. The king, in a desperate attempt to do something, raised his fist and screamed. He blamed everything on the system that had tricked him and made him do this to his world. His fist slammed into the red window. He screamed and blamed it all on the system. But nothing changed. Only the notifications got bigger, and they started telling the king that the destruction of Uranos was imminent. But that didn't help. The windows kept popping up. More and more information about the new features of the game appeared in them. Transferring players to another world was underway. The windows said that the destruction of Uranos had been confirmed. The system received the highest level of access. The king's hometown was being destroyed before his eyes. The city was enveloped in red flames of destruction. Pillars of flame and force erupted from all directions. Whatever they touched was destroyed. The users didn't realize what was happening. The game was dissolving before their eyes. They were screaming that the game was broken. Their bodies were disappearing. Everything around them was collapsing. The world was dissolving into pixels, and no one realized what had suddenly happened. When progress was at the 70% mark, the king saw the core of the game begin to collapse over his head. The system said that they had destroyed everything together. Shards were flying in different directions with a crackling sound. Red notices surrounded the king in a circle with warnings written on them. There was a deafening explosion, and progress reached the 100% mark. The king's heart symbol lit up on the system screen. Rocks flew everywhere. The explosion began. New windows appeared. The system was telling the king that everything had changed, and interesting challenges would await the players in the new world. The king looked at the new alerts. Numbers and game codes flashed by. There were to be new adventures, in a new world. The king was angry and yelled at the system. It had tricked him and put his world in danger. Everything turned a red-pink color. Pillars of explosion erupted from beneath the ground. In the sky, too, these pillars of power were shining. They were destroying everything they touched. A huge blast wave engulfed Uranos. The king suddenly snapped out of it and rushed somewhere, hoping to change the course of events or save someone. Red pillars of power appeared in the sky. A huge surge of power rumbled over the horizon, destroying everything it could reach. There was a massive bright red explosion. The force engulfed the king. He dissolved into it. A window popped up one last time, informing them that the king was the most important player. The system promised that they would meet the king once more and test what he was capable of. The king's heart flew, pixels and pictures changed. The world changed completely. Gradually, one picture replaced another. A new sky began to appear. Earth. Pixels became less and less. In their place was a picture of the real world. The king's heart flew on. Following the sky, new vegetation appeared. The leaves looked like real leaves. And so the king found himself in a new world. Gradually, the pixels disappeared, and a normal picture appeared. He sat on the ground and looked around confused. His appearance had changed. The armor was gone. His face had become human. The king didn't have any equipment or weapons with him. Wang Yuan was confused. He looked at the blue sky and tried to understand what had happened. He twisted his head around looking for a road he should take. He found himself alone in the desert. There was emptiness everywhere. He walked along the sand, leaving footprints behind him. Ka-Friend stopped as there was no more path. Wang Yuan stood on the edge of a cliff. Beside him, birds flew by. The king stood and looked at the new world with amazement, one that was unlike the previous one. His mouth opened in amazement. His eyes opened wide. A drop of sweat ran down his face. There were many forests in the new world. A volcano was smoking. In the middle of the forest was the skeleton of an ancient animal. The king stood on the edge of a cliff and looked around at a new world he didn't recognize. In the blue sky, different birds flew by. The king, with a sigh of disappointment, thought about how easy it was to fool him. He was the most important character in the game, and some virus had fooled him so easily. He felt ashamed of his act. His red eyes looked on with regret. While he was pondering, suddenly an alert popped up that he had made it to Uranos. The king was dumbfounded because he was 100% sure that this was definitely not his world. The king of Uranos knew all about it. The king stood next to the Uranos sign in his mind. He was angry. He had cut up the entire plaque with that name on it, since this world was not Uranos. He panted with anger and his eyes burned with fire. A blue alert came up saying that the game was missing an exit button. The players wished it would come back. It was more peaceful that way. They demanded that the button be brought back, but the system wrote that the door to the real world would be open. But there was one but. The girl read the alert. Her dark eyes looked at the notifications on the screen about how there would always be a way out to the real world. But there was one but. The players were horrified to find that their avatars had become like they were from real life. They were looking into the system screen like a mirror. One of the players thought it was illegal, how the system could know what he looked like in real life. And to get out of the game, you have to get to the main island alive. The king stood in front of the forest, where the red eyes of the monsters were staring at him. He was very angry and cursed the system for everything it had done to him and his world. The king was worried about the players and was concerned for them. He thought most of them were scared and didn't know what to do next. He wanted to go in search of them, to help them. He clenched his teeth with anger and, full of determination, decided to set off. Wang Yuan turned around and headed into the forest with all his determination to rescue the players. But the system enveloped him in a blue color and moved him to another location. But suddenly, everything under his feet lit up in blue color. The system started giving notifications. The character was transported to the first stop, cloud exploration. The system notified that in this place they will stay 3 days. For a more comfortable stay in this world, the duration will be so long. A weapon must be selected. The king's name is now the traveler Wang Yuan. He was teleported to a beach near the forest. The system showed Wang Yuan the strat characteristics of the character. Everywhere was the most entry level. The character was very weak. The character suddenly heard the system's notification and turned around in horror, watching what was happening. He looked at his level and progress. The king was distressed. He looked at his character's stats. There were ones and even zeros everywhere. How could the former king have such weak characteristics? Wang Yuan looked at his spreadsheet and was dumbfounded and even angry. The system congratulated the king for being ranked for the first time, but unfortunately for the king, it was a ranking of the weakest players in the game. Wang Yuan was simply dumbfounded by such news. He didn't understand why this had happened. How could the king of the Uranos continent become so weak? How could the king of the continent become such a weakling? Wang Yuan made a facepalm. His entire body trembled with anger and indignation. He was shouting and angry at the injustice. He didn't have to start from the beginning, from the bottom. He stomped his feet and thought about the injustice. Since he appeared before the players in such a weak body, so why should he have to start the game from the beginning? Isn't there any other way? He was the strongest king of this continent. After thinking for a moment, Wang Yuan assumed that this was a failed prank. The system said that the player's level was closely related to his body from the real world. And since Wang Yuan had never existed in the real world, that meant he was one of the weakest players. The system alerted that the level was dependent on the body in the real world. Wang Yuan slumped and hunched over, opening his mouth in frustration. The system promised to match the skills and tasks that matched the level. But in order to do so, certain conditions of the system must be met. Wang Yuan studied the tournament table and thought about the fact that someone had surpassed him. Who was that person? Jin Yao An was even weaker than the king. Wang Yuan was worried about this player. The king was very dissatisfied with what had happened. The system promised that there would be many ways to raise the level. But first, a starting weapon must be chosen. Wang Yuan agreed and asked the system to show what weapons it had. The system unfolded the types of weapons in front of the king. A sword could be used if the player had more points in strength or defense. A staff could be used if the player had more points from the section with intelligence. An accurate bow and arrow can be used if there are a lot of points in the dexterity section. Also, a dagger decorated with gems served the same purpose. Wang Yuan looked at the selection of weapons. The king noticed that it was very similar to how it was in his world, on Uranus. He remembered how it was in his home world. Weapons determined a player's class. 4 weapons were the 4 starting classes. The first 2 classes were of assassin and warrior. The assassin wore a hood, his face was hidden, and he held a sharp dagger in his hands. The second class was the knight. It was a large man wearing armor and a sword in his hands. Each class had a different path of development. Once the weapons were mastered, it would be possible to change classes. The player classes surfaced in the king's mind. It was a young man with a powerful bow launching an arrow, a female mage, at the end of her staff, whose magic power shone. The king grinned. So not everything was changed, but something remained the same. He smiled happily, crossing his arms over his torso. Examining the weapons, the king thought about the fact that the fewer changes to the game, the better for him and the players. He leafed through the catalog of weapons, looking closely at the details, and choosing which weapon would suit him. Having decided on a choice, the king pulled a shining dagger from the blue window. He pulled a weapon from the blue window. Blue lightning flashed everywhere. The system immediately notified the king that he now had the starting class of assassin. Selecting the dagger, the system moved our hero to the assassin class and added characteristics to the character. The costume was also changed. The blue swirls of the system swirled around the king. The king looked at his body and observed the changes. Strength and dexterity were increased. But for some reason, nothing had changed in the character traits. Looking at the system panel, the king was puzzled, because for some reason they did not increase. Pointing his finger at the characteristics window, the king asked why nothing had happened. Suddenly his finger passed through the blue system window and strange things began to happen. It felt as if his finger had gone through water. The touch made circles like water. The system alerted the king that he had touched the core memory, and a unique skill would now be unlocked. Wang Yuan touched the blue panel. That is to say, one had to touch the screen to change skills. The king became the first player to touch the system. For that, the system gave him a special box as a gift that could be unlocked when they arrived at the main island. The king also gained a special skill. Memories began to flicker in his eyes. The king recalled how he had changed the settings of the game in the past body when he touched the system. His strong hands skillfully handled the settings to the game. The blue window shone brighter and brighter and notified the king that he had unlocked a unique skill. This light literally illuminated the king. The king stood there not realizing what was happening. He questioned the system. The king was yelling at the system. Why did it hide this unique skill? How would he know what the skill was? And how would he be able to use it? Wang Yuan stood there scratching the back of his head. He was pointlessly shouting at the system in an effort to find out exactly what skill he was able to obtain. But suddenly, hitting the king in the face that he dropped his dagger, some force flew out. The blow was very strong. The king might very well have lost his teeth. The king's hair and clothes scattered in different directions. The king shouted profanities and flew very far away. He flew so swiftly and quickly that he couldn't believe he was attacked by this monster. The system wouldn't let him swear and censored the profanity. But Wang Yuan wasn't so simple. In flight, he managed to group himself to land on his feet. He did a backflip, performing this trick peerlessly. The king landed, looking menacingly at the system, fire blazing in his eyes. His hands and feet left marks on the ground. In this way, he was trying to slow down and stall. The king's dagger pressed against the ground, ready to use it at any moment. Wang Yuan began to look straight ahead and kept questioning the pop-up. He screamed and didn't understand why the system was mocking him. Just as suddenly, he noticed an elite monster, apparently the one he would have to fight. Wang Yuan threw away his dagger. After all, he simply did not expect to see such an opponent. Wang Yuan was taken aback. The monster looked harmless. It looked like a small ball with eyes. It only had eyes and small horns sticking out. Its whole body was pink and translucent. It spoke mew, like a cat. Wang Yuan froze and looked at the little monster. Would he have to fight with it? He thought it was a mistake or a joke. He had already prepared to adopt a battle stance, but now he felt foolish. How could anyone take this little monster seriously? Wang Yuan shouted out. He recognized this monster as a slime monster. At the same time, this creature's stats were better than the king himself. The strength and health, agility levels were 5 times higher than the king's. However, this creature's intelligence was at 0. Wang Yuan asked the system why the monster's stats were not based on its body evaluation. The system explained that there was no slime in the real world. In front of him stood a multi-story slime camp. A pink piece of slime stood nearby and defended its domain. The system alerted the king that he now needed to capture the slime camp. This is the first mission. With that, the slime itself went into a fighting stance, ready to defend itself. When the slime slammed into Wang Yuan, its impact was so strong that bright sparks sprinkled from the impact with the blade. The king was thrown aside. Suddenly, that pink lump of slime suddenly attacked the king, striking him in the stomach. The king felt a strong blow. The king crossed his arms to fend off the attack. It took a large amount of strength for him to do so. Droplets of sweat ran down his face. He clenched his teeth from the effort. Because of the difference in characteristics, the king realized that it was impossible to fight in close combat. The slime attacked intensely. The blow from the enemy felt especially intense. At a glance, it was impossible to think that such a strong blow could be delivered by a small pink colobus. Gathering all his strength, the king threw the pink slime away from him. It jumped from side to side, constantly attacking the king. But he successfully dodged it, as he remembered the fighting skills from his past life. Eventually, the king was able to strike the slime with his dagger. The red dagger sank into the pink monster's body. Wang Yuan's red eyes glowed with fire. He channeled all his strength into the strike and expected that his dagger could destroy the monster. Wang Yuan was surprised that even with such a serious blow, the slime had no damage. The Uranos would still have a health point taken away, even if the player couldn't tear the defense. The system issued a notification that the king had little strength and would not be able to do serious damage to the slime. The slime bounced off the king. He was very surprised, since in his previous life, if such a thing happened, he would still be able to deal damage to the opponent. The king was surprised that nothing had changed. Drops of sweat were running down his face. His eyebrows were raised upwards. The system was reminding the king that he could move a single item an unlimited number of times. After pondering for a bit longer, Wang Yuan began to guess how to win this battle. He shouted out the characterization window. In one hand, the king had a dagger, and with the other hand, he was going to change his characteristics. This had to be done as quickly as possible, as the pink slime kept attacking. He called up the characteristics window, as he remembered that in his unique skill, he could move items. And if he could move his characteristics, it would serve him well in defeating the enemy. A blue screen with a set of characteristics popped up in front of his eyes. Wang Yuan pondered over the best way to proceed. The slime was attacking, but the king was looking at his panel. He was going to change his characteristics. For example, increase his luck to 10 points. His choice fell on the luck point. Tapping his finger, he waited for the change. His eyes quickly slid across the blue screen, choosing the right decision. He was overjoyed as his thought worked, and the slider in the characteristics began to move. While he was rejoicing, a pink slime was furiously rushing towards him, ready to attack. It was going to attack from the back. The king stood and studied the characteristics of his character on the system blue window. The slime was ready to stab the king in the back as he stood next to the blue character sheet. But then abruptly, a cheerful king with a grin on his face turned toward the slime. He called him his buddy and had already mentally destroyed the little pink monster. The king was sure he would win, as he had moved the 0 symbol on his power, and now he had 10 points against the slime's 5 points. His finger selected the right characteristics for his character. There was a terrifying thump and rumble. In a pile of dust and rocks lay the king, defeated by the slime's blow. A mighty thud was heard. The defeated king was lying on the ground and didn't understand why it failed. He was surprised and annoyed. The king's kick didn't work out, so he also took health damage. The system wrote that it failed to break through the pink monster's defense. During the strike, It failed to break through the slime's defense. The king was surprised by this. All the characteristics remained the same. For some reason, the king misused his skill. All the characters' stats went back to the same level. The system gave hints. You had to save the characters. The king flew in the air after being hit by the slime. He spun like a Yule. The slime sat on the ground and smirked gloatingly. The king screamed and cursed as he was once again attacked by the slime, which hit him and sent him flying into the air. The system told him that at least one character should be left in the characteristic, and it was not 0. The king didn't understand then why he had succeeded at first. The annoyed king landed, with abrasions and bruises visible on him. The system kept giving hints. Stats with one character cannot be moved. It was written on the notification board. The king wondered what he could do. Since there was only one character left, he only had one chance left. He realized what action he had to take and what he had to change. The system was alarming. His health level was below a safe norm. Something had to be changed immediately. The slime continued to attack while the king pondered what to do. He made the decision to change his characteristics. He swiped one finger across the screen. Instantly, his skills changed. Slime flew towards the king, but he was ready to repel the blow. And then, making a final decision, Wan Yuan changed his characteristics. He stood, and behind his back, a monster was torn apart. A bright red punch tore the little monster apart. Pieces of pink slime flew everywhere. The king was imperturbably cool. A powerful punch rang out and the slime was defeated. The king was confident of his victory, rubbing his slime dagger. Wang Yuan grinned. After all, he had successfully changed his strength. He had gotten a health potion for his victory. His skill proficiency had increased, and the characteristics had been improved. But something was wrong, and the king soon saw what the problem was. But then suddenly, the two halves of the slime began to separate, as if nothing had happened at all. But somehow the slime's health remained the same, and now from the two halves of the monster, two more monsters appeared, identical to each other. The two new slimes split up, ready to attack the king at any moment. The terms of the quest have changed again. Now the king must destroy the two opponents, capture their camp, and head deep into the island. That is, the task not only did not end, but on the contrary became even more difficult, and the king absolutely did not understand how to solve this problem. The king screamed about the unfairness of the mission and ran with all his legs away from the new slime. In his world, the slime was blue in color and had absolutely no properties of pink. It took the king a while to realize what the problem was here. This all seemed wrong to him. Wan Yuan suddenly stopped and remembered how it was in his world. Sweat was running down his face. He was trying to find a way to deal with these monsters as quickly as possible. He turned around and took another look at the slimes, remembering what they looked like in his world. The two slimes were jumping around like hoppers and attacking at the same time. They were no different from each other. He looked at the slime that kept attacking and thought about the fact that in his world it was not pink, but blue. So there were parasites that could divide. It was the pink color in his world that was responsible for such abilities of these monsters. The king remembered that the color of the monster had a very strong influence on its abilities. That's when a memory surfaced that they had discussed this with the system back then on Uranos, a parasite pavel plant that divides to germinate. It was this plant that they had taken with the system to create the slime. Monsters infected with pink would become parasites and could divide. Each time the slime would destroy, it would grow larger, and there were twice as many parasites. The king spun around in the air and landed on his feet. His red eyes glittered. He held a dagger in his hand and was about to attack the enemy. The red scarf around his neck was developing. This kind of slime was impossible to destroy. One had to look for other ways, so a special skill had to be activated. Once again, changing his characteristics, the king dodged the attack. Wan Yuan was very fast. He was rushing faster than the slimes. His eyes flashed with red flames. A bright light stretched behind him. His hair fluttered in the wind from the speed he was traveling. The king was rushing as fast as he could. Pink slime flowed down his fingers. This meant that he was able to damage the monster's defense barrier. Striking the slime, the king fled from it, glaring with red eyes. The slime could be seen between his fingers. The slime froze in place. Cracks ran through its body that would just about destroy it. Between the king's fingers were two small peas that he pulled out of the slime. The system congratulated the king for discerning the enemy disguise, and for that, he got 2 parasites. The king stood in a victorious posture, for there was nothing left of the slime behind his back. He extracted the parasites and thus won the battle. He completed the challenge in 29 minutes. The system alerted that he had completed the quest, captured the vermin camp, and also ripped the cores out of them. System notifications appeared one by one about the king getting bonuses for completing the mission, how long it took, how many bonus points he would get. The king unlocked a basic skill, Stalker. On the king's belt, the compass glowed bright blue sparks. The king thought about why this monster was the first challenge, since the other players couldn't know how to defeat it. It was a very tough challenge. The king only managed it because he knew about these vermin and how to deal with it. Wan Yuan was worried about the other players, whether they could defeat the slime. He stood and looked deep into the forest. Wan Yuan was very worried about the players. Just then, the compass on the king's belt vibrated. He had received this compass as a reward for completing the first task. Meanwhile, in our reality, in the cybersecurity agency, the phones were ringing non-stop. It was a mess, with employees running around, picking up phones. Binders of reports were being carried. Personal belongings and papers were lying everywhere. People were relentlessly answering the phones and reassuring the players that everything was going to be okay, and they were doing what they could. That a rescue team would be on the scene soon, and they would sort it all out. They reassured people that removing the glasses would not cause the death of the real body, and that it was all rumors. A lot of men in business suits and virtual glasses reassured people that everything was fine. A man with long gray hair stood there, sad that the day had just started and the office was such a mess. Phone calls and shouting from employees could be heard everywhere. A man was on the phone asking if the staff had found any leads in the case. He held a cigarette in his long fingers, ash falling from it onto the floor. His nameplate read, Head of the Investigative Division. He thought about the fact that such a big game was hard to crack, and it was definitely not clean. A cigarette smoked between his fingers. The man took a drag on the cigarette and thought, who could have ruined this game so badly? The man had a mustache and a beard. He was wearing a business suit of good quality. He spoke on the phone about what he had an inkling of what had happened. Puffs of smoke came out of his mouth. He thought that perhaps the cause was the continent of Uranos. It was the most possible of all causes. The man's name was Chief Liu. He was on the phone, but he was called out. He crumpled a cigarette in his hand. He had a gray beard on his face. He was a tall and slender man of age. He was wearing special virtual reality goggles over his eyes. The deputy department head called out to the gray-haired man who was his boss. The employee informed him that something had just happened. The deputy held a folder in his hands. It was a young man with short hair. He greeted the chief and smilingly told him the good news. The deputy reported that they were able to enter the game with the help of special technology. The man sat in a chair with many wires running from it. The man was wearing a special suit, and on his head was a virtual reality helmet. The supervisor was shocked and angry. He said that they were all crazy to have started such a risky business. He glared angrily at the employee. How did they venture into such a risky endeavor without asking him? The research compass was a very useful thing. It could be used in this storyline. On it you could see enemies, allies, items, achievements of the main island. The research compass allowed you to see all of this. It helped track the objectives of the game. The king was just using the compass and looking for the right item. He was swiveling his head around looking for what the compass was pointing to. Behind the king was a captured slime camp. Holding the compass in his hand, he looked up in search of the object. More specifically, it turned out to be a man, who was to be found. But there was a scream so loud that even the birds flew out of the trees in fright. Or rather, a rumble, for a man had fallen from the tree right under the king's feet. The king watched as a man fell from the tree in front of him. Wan Yuan put his foot on the tree. He was holding a dagger in one hand and had a research compass clutched in the other. He was surprised as the man thundered down from the tree with a loud noise. In front of the king was a young man in a cloak. He was kneeling and coughing. The cloak was worn on his body, and on his face was a hood, so the king could not immediately see his face. Then the king asked the man who he was, but the young man was frightened and crawled even farther away. He landed painfully on his heel, but the pain was no less than the fear of the stranger. The man with gray eyes and hair looked at the king with terror. The young man was nervous and tried to think of what to say to the king. He looked away. The mage chewed on the leaves of the herb and pretended that it tasted very good to him. when the system sent notifications to the king that he had found his first traveling companion. The compass data would be updated. And then the young man told him that he had climbed a tree to eat the delicious fruit, but it was clear he was lying. The system issued a new notification. In order to provide the best experience for the players, the game provided a different beach for everyone. However, soon the airship will pick up the players. The faster you find the players, the better it will be. And then the system gave out that the king had met a traveling companion and they must complete a new task together. He had to find 3 more people to travel off the island together. This task was made available by the Explorer Compass. Players can trust their traveling companions. The king was so excited about the player that he shouted for joy, but his traveling companion was only more scared. He was afraid that the king would hit him because the king looked like a strong player. The mage tried to move away from the king and take cover as he feared a sudden attack. The king was already mentally scolding himself for scaring the player so much. In his mind, he was crushing himself for his haste. And to smooth the impression, he also tried to eat the fruit of the tree, pretending that he tasted good. And that caused a lot of questions from the new player. The player smiled at the king, but was mentally terrified because the grass was inedible. He pretended to eat it so he wouldn't get beaten up or something bad done to him. The king chewed the grass, thinking the players liked it. His companion did not understand the reason for the king's behavior, because he himself was eating the leaves, only because he was afraid. Is the king mocking him, or is he really that stupid, not a strong character? The player pondered the reasons for the king's behavior and thought that the king probably only knows how to fight. That's why he's behaving so strangely. After all, the magician had seen several players who behaved differently in the game. The player secretly watched the other players fighting, noting the details. The red-haired young man with the sword didn't notice the obstacle. He swung his sword, but his actions produced poor results. But could he be the one to handle the slime and be able to take over their camp? He looked for someone who could take over the monster's camp, but he saw the players losing. The mage watched as the weaker players didn't even try to fight the slime, taking hits from it and running away, hoping to escape. That's what the young white-haired player did. And the system would alert as the horses were leaving the game, which really freaked the man out. For in front of him, a player who failed turned into a gravestone. The system wrote that Lindsay's journey ended here, in the game. The player recalled these moments and trembled in terror. He was afraid of such an outcome. To find himself in the shoes of a losing player was not just scary, but also life-threatening. After all, no one knew what the game would do to the real body in real life. Suddenly, you won't go back. So the player decided to seek help from the king and offer him friendship. He called the king bro, and with uncertainty in his voice, asked him for help. He asked the king if the king had enough strength to go along. The king looked silly at this point. He was chewing a leaf from a tree, as he thought that was the kind of thing the players liked. Right now, no one would be able to say that not long ago, the person who chewed the leaves defeated the monsters. A player told how he saw a king fighting a slime, and was impressed by this battle. The mage was passing by and couldn't help but be amazed by the king's abilities. Especially, he had yet to see anyone in the game who had pulled it off. No one had ever taken over the slime camp. The player showed a performance as the king fought the monster. Wan Yuan battled the slime with the speed of light, and the pink monsters had no choice but to lose this battle. The player's performance was masterful, so the king was amazed by his abilities. The man fell on his knee in front of the embarrassed king and called him a god. The rays of the sun illuminated the confused king, though he had to be used to people kneeling before him. After all, in the past, he was the king of an entire continent and was worshipped. After hearing all that, the king said that this was a simple task for beginners, and the players should be able to handle it. But the mage didn't think so. He had seen stronger players fail the mission and even die during it. Especially he himself had not been able to complete the mission yet. The man was embarrassed and couldn't find anything to say. He pondered for a moment, and then he told the king. He chose his words for a long time to ask for help in completing the pink slime mission. The player said that he had a problem, that in this whole island, only the king would be able to help him. He needed to complete the first mission. A gray-haired man grabbed the head of the department by the shirt. He said that the technical department hadn't submitted the data yet, so why would the department head send the staff to certain death? The supervisor didn't understand the problem after all. The people were experienced employees. The department head said that he sent 12 groups of the most experienced people, but only one got through the protection of Uranos. He smiled and regretted that this had happened. The disgruntled boss still towered over him, but the man wasn't too embarrassed by it. The chief was angry and kept repeating that only one employee had gotten through the game. That was reassuring, because if someone got hurt, he would have to personally bear the responsibility. There was a chance that it really wasn't that dangerous. At least that was the hope. The department head patted the chief on the shoulder and told him not to worry. The older man stood and digested the information. The security officer had found a loophole and entered the game, which meant that somehow he would be able to send them intelligence. The chief was surprised to hear that the employee that was able to penetrate the game was his most talented student. His bright eyes rounded with surprise. He was more than a little scared for his student. A man named Jin Yaoan had gotten into the game. He was lying in a special camera and virtual reality goggles. This was the boss's best disciple. There were high hopes for him, but the boss really wanted him to stay safe and not get hurt in the game. The sun was shining and birds were flying in the sky. The king was chatting with his new companion. He was telling about how he had gotten to the island and still had not been able to complete the first task. The companion told him that for some reason he had gotten to the island and had not completed the first task. He thought it was a bug in the system. He began his story about how he had to escape the pink monsters, and he had no choice but to run and hide to save his life. The companion recounted that when he fought the monster, his attacks were ineffective. So he was thrown back to a tree where he grabbed a fruit, and then the system gave a clue to the unlucky player. It seems that this particular fruit could have saved his life from the pink monsters. The system alerted him that if you throw this fruit, it will explode, and then the man began to furiously throw these fruits slime. There were explosions everywhere. There was smoke, so the magician did not see what was happening to his enemy. But he really hoped that his tactics would work and he could win. At some point he stopped and noticed that it wasn't helping. It was only making things worse. After all, the slugs were not decreasing, but somehow increasing in number. For a moment he stopped throwing fruit. When the smoke cleared, there were already many slime monsters looking at him, and they were all ready to attack. Their eyes glistened, and their small bodies looked brand new and never once damaged. The mage didn't know exactly how many slime monsters were chasing him. The player was very dumbfounded by this. He threw away the rest of the fruit and almost cried. He had only one hope of rescue left, and that was to run as far away from the pink monsters as possible. So he climbed down from the tree and in a terrible hurry began to run away from the many pink monsters, which he created himself, because he threw fruit bombs at them. He cried, snot and drool running down his face. He screamed in fear that the system was mocking him. The king listened to the story and remarked that he was very impressed with how the player had behaved. The mage scratched the back of his head in embarrassment. The king glared wryly at the player. Cg Yuan confessed to the king that he didn't know that slugs had such a feature that they could share. The king opened the system notification and said that in order to help the player with the task, they should first create a group to share the mage's task. The player rejoiced. The mage called the king Bro and was glad that Bro would help him with this pink slime challenge. The system wrote, saying that player Wang Yuan was ready to form a group. The man gladly accepted this request, hoping that the trial could now be completed without much trouble. The man turned out to be a mage, and his name was Ji Yuan. He decided to stick together with Wang Yuan. He asked the king to accompany him, although it was noticeable that the same mage's health level was much higher. But Ji Yuan was determined to gain this player's trust. The mage looked at Wang Yuan's stats and was amazed that he only had 1 health point. The king didn't understand what had surprised the mage so much. The mage froze in shock looking at the king's characterization. The mage was so amazed that he shouted very loudly. All the birds scattered. After all, the king's characteristics had only 1 point of health, which clearly did not indicate that the mage was the strongest player in front of him. After all, he was so hopeful of defeating the slime. Xie Yuan was upset when he saw the king's health, although the latter explained that it was a side effect of his special skill. If the king wanted to become stronger, Wang Yuan turned to the mage and promised to help him with the mission. The king said that the chance of error had decreased and seemed to know how to help the mage deal with the slime. Although Ji Yuan was very worried that he seemed to have chosen the wrong player. He was crying in his heart with resentment. The king was confident in himself. He looked cool as he stood in the sunlight. The sun illuminated his friendly face. His red eyes looked at the mage with kindness. Wang Yuan asked Xie Ji Yuan if he was willing to trust him. He extended his hand to his companion and waited for his answer. The mage was nervous, but he was agreeable to the king's terms and trusted him. He chuckled nervously and clarified with the king what their plan of action was and what the mage himself had to do to accomplish it. Then Wang Yuan suspended the mage as bait and waited for the slime to attack. The mage swayed on the tree, unable to do anything. He was shocked and vulnerable. Cautiously, he looked back and forth at the camp, then at the king. The slime camp loomed before them. A multitude of pink monsters walked and defended the camp. The king showed the mage a raised finger upwards. He himself stayed in the ambush. He promised that everything would be fine. This was his plan of action after completing the mission. Xie Ji Yuan was scared and upset. He was thinking about Wang Yuan testing him. The mage hung on the tree like a statue. He was scared and hot. He didn't know what to expect from his new companion, and he wasn't entirely sure if the king could truly handle the task at hand. The mage called the king a bro and asked how he was going to deal with a huge army of slugs. The mage was worried that the king was taking big risks fighting so many opponents. At this time, the king was watching the slugs, coming up with a plan in his head. The king tossed the stone in the air and asked his buddy not to worry, as he had everything under control. Wang Yuan said he would help the mage begin his trial. He just had to wait a bit. He promised that nothing terrible would happen and the mage wouldn't get hurt. Pink slugs were walking on the beach. They were scattered in different places, and they didn't look at all in the direction of the king and his companion. Then the king swung a stone at the army of pink slimes, which roused them all. They shuddered and searched for the source of the disturbance. The little pink monsters became angry and turned towards the king, their eyes shining with anger. The little bodies were ready to attack whoever decided to encroach on their camp. At that very moment, the king hid in the green bushes, only the edge of his clothes sticking out. So the monsters had no choice but to attack the one they saw in the tree. And that was a tied-up, frightened mage, waiting for the king's help, who served as bait. The mage was very badly frightened, a look of terror on his face. He was waiting for his end. Droplets of sweat ran down his face. He froze in amazement. When the pink slugs began to pounce on him, he screamed and waved his staff furiously. He was crying, snot dripping from his nose, and the mage was mentally saying goodbye to his life. He was thinking about how he would fight off those blows. He shouted for the pink monsters to stay away from him. At that very moment, the slime was attacked by some black swift shadow. The mage didn't even have time to see anything. He only saw this shadow hitting the pink monsters, and from the blows of this shadow, the slime disintegrated into small pieces, so the mage never needed to fight them. The mage was shocked by such a swift and fast attack. He didn't expect the king to be so strong. He watched with interest as the battle continued. The mage was covered in sweat from the ordeal. His gray eyes watched the king with surprise. His mouth was open in surprise. His eyebrows were raised. The king stood with a weapon in his hand. The slime had been destroyed. He looked cool. The system triggered an alert. The king had a stealth skill, which gave him a lot of advantages. For every enemy destroyed, his movement speed increased by 10%. Wang Yuan embarrassedly asked the suspended mage how he felt about his new skill. And in general, the king expected praise from his traveling companion for his successful mission. The mage looked down at the king and waited for him to bring him down, as hanging from the tree was very uncomfortable. The system notified them that the mage's mission was complete. The weapon returned to the inventory. The king smiled happily and looked at the mage hanging from the tree. At that very moment, a young black-haired girl was watching them. Her eyes were as black as night. Her hands wore white gloves. She was hiding behind a tree trunk and was thinking about something. The girl with black eyes watched the king and thought that he was not so easy to defeat. Her gaze was filled with anger and interest. She tried to hide before the king and the mage could notice her. The mage checked his notifications and realized that the system had not counted the slime as a victory for him. The king looked at his hand where the parasites lay. Xie Ji Yuan was very upset. He had already done a lot to achieve victory in this trial. The panel said that 0 out of 10 parasites had been collected. The king transferred the parasites into the magician's hand, hoping that the system would give him credit for defeating the pink monsters. The mage opened his palms and set up 2 hands at once. His task was to collect 10 parasites and discern their disguises. The system did not count the transfer of the parasites because ZG Yuan's player inventory was full. The parasite cores simply jumped out of the mage's hands. Wan Yuan and Xie Ji Yuan were surprised by this. Xie Ji Yuan chuckled embarrassedly and began to check his inventory. According to him, there was nothing special in there. He looked at his panel, looking at what was in his inventory. He showed the king that his inventory was full of exploding fruits that he had collected while fighting the slime. They filled almost all of the mage's storage. There were 9 fruits in each slot, and at the bottom was a description of the properties of those fruits. The king was unhappily silent and awaited a response from his interlocutor. Wan Yuan clarified how many fruits the mage had taken, to which he replied that since he could not fight, the fruit he took to save his life, and he would have taken more if the system allowed it. The mage spoke of this with embarrassment, while the king grinned at us. Checking the amount of fruit, the mage decided to give the king some exploding fruit. Just the space freed up could be used for parasite eggs. The system notification prompted the king to accept the gift from player Xie Ji Yuan. Xie Ji Yuan offered the king 18 fruits. Just in the space that was vacated, the parasite nuclei could be placed. The mage was going to give these fruits as a thank you for his help, but he was worried that it wouldn't be enough for the king. Xie Ji Yuan was very worried that the king wouldn't accept his gift or think it wasn't good enough. He was counting in his head that sooner or later he would be able to seize the opportunity and find out what the king really wanted and what he could use to get him on his side. While the mage was thinking about what else he could bribe the king with, he looked at the fruit with admiration. Stars were burning in his eyes. Wan Yuan looked at the 2 red and shiny fruits with admiration. This picture shocked the mage, for he had expected a different reaction from a strong warrior. Before the fruits fell into Wan Yuan's hands, the system had alerted him that he had unlocked the recognition skill. At this moment, the mage was carefully watching the king and was afraid that he wouldn't need the fruit. The king looked with his red eyes at the notifications. It said that the greater the value and quantity of the gift, the higher the recognition scale. Right now, the scale was 21.6% full. He was given a bonus for the first gift from a player. The system also notified him that once the recognition scale was filled to 1,000, a new skill level would begin to unlock. The king grinned when he heard this news. Especially this scale was replenished by any gifts given to the king from other players. The king was very excited. He always knew he could please the players. Stars sparkled around him. He wagged his tail like a contented cat. The mage thought to himself that the king had helped him solve a huge problem. But at the same time, Wan Yuan was also happy about a small gift like fruit. The magician didn't understand why the king was happy that other people were taking advantage of his kindness. He thought about Wan Yuan being taken advantage of, and he was grateful because he believed that other players were helping him. The mage twirled his hair and didn't know how to hint this to the king. The king suddenly interrupted the mage's thoughts. He called out to him, touching him on the shoulder, and offered the parasite cores. The system alerted that player Xie Ji Yuan had completed the main quest, received the research compass, and could begin a joint quest with Wan Yuan to find traveling companions. They finally succeeded in opening a joint traveling companion quest. The king called the mage with him to search for the rest of their company. Under the light of the rays, the king looked very cool. His dark hair glistened, his black armor gleamed, and his red eyes radiated warmth. Xie Ji Yuan was surprised that the king wanted to take him with him on a search for people. He looked at the king with distrust and was afraid that he would change his mind. His gray eyes studied the king carefully. Xie Ji Yuan put on his hood and headed after the king. In his heart, he thought he was a complete fool who was going to help other people for nothing, although those could very well use the king for their own purposes. The mage happily agreed to go with the king, said to go in a different direction, as the traveling companions were there. He had seen some of them. He also informed the king that none of them were up to the task, and the king's help here would come in handy. Xie Ji Yuan said that he had seen a few players before meeting the king, and led him to the place where he had met them. They passed by the skeleton of some ancient monster. The head of this monster had horns. The size of this monster was as big as modern high-rise buildings. They reached the beach where they saw a stone, a player who had gone to the other world. The system alerted the king that he had lost one of his traveling companions. This made the king very sad. The mage also sat next to him and was sad. He placed a white flower on the gravestone. At the second beach, they met a boy named Hua Huan. He became their second traveling companion. The boy was scared and crying. It seemed that he was not only afraid of monsters, but also of the king himself. Wan Yuan handed the boy a handful of pink vermin nuclei and explained that it was needed to complete the level. On the third beach, a mere mountain of slugs appeared before them. This mountain exceeded the height of all the players. They were shocked to see so many monsters. The players stood up like a stumbling block and looked around this mountain for the lost companion they were hoping to find. The king ran into the huge mountain of slugs. He looked for the man and hoped he was all right. He raked the bodies of the monsters with his hands, and through a small crevice he saw a very tired man in front of him, who was breathing heavily from fatigue, but continued to fight. The king turned on his skill and raised a huge mountain of slime. There he saw a panting young man. The red-haired youth was desperately swinging his sword, endlessly separating the slimes. He was shouting very loudly that he wasn't afraid of the slimes, and was willing to fight them for as long as it took. The red-haired young man was out of breath. He was already all red from the constant physical effort. He was hitting the slime, and he didn't stop for a moment. Suddenly the young man noticed among the mountain of pink slugs the king, who rushed to his aid. The slugs were beating against Wang Yuan's body, hitting him several times in the face. But the king was glad that the player was still fine. He sent him an invitation to join their team. The young man stared questioningly and didn't understand what was going on and who Wang Yuan was. The young man stared questioningly at the king, not understanding how the king had even appeared here and what he wanted from him. He was holding a sword and breathing heavily as he fought off the attacks of the pink slime without stopping, a mountain of which was on all sides next to the new player. They looked at each other. There was a mountain of slime in the background. Warrior Lu Ajeng had a good level of health and strength. Wang Yuan, on the other hand, couldn't boast the same stats, but still the slime couldn't break through his defense. So he was unharmed and glad that he had reached the third traveling companion. Wang Yuan saw that the slimes couldn't break through this player's defense. His eyes sparkled. He smiled at the new player. The king promised that he would take on the rest of the slimes, and immediately began to fulfill his promise. Wang Yuan unlocked his skill and began to destroy the pink monsters. He hit them with such force that they bounced off his dagger like balls, and the impact was so strong that it left a black trail behind him. He destroyed many monsters, moved quickly, increased his agility, but lost strength. His stats were constantly changing. Dexterity increased by a few units, but strength decreased. This was his special skill. His red eyes glittered. His dagger hands moved quickly and clearly. The system wrote that he was performing one combo after another, the monsters melting before his eyes. The final total was a combo X1024. Wang Yuan moved like a tornado, destroying the monsters. Pieces of monsters flew. Black and red flashes of power flashed. He created a huge black funnel, so fast was he moving. A dumbfounded swordsman looked up at this funnel from below. Lu Ajeng watched the king with astonishment. He opened his mouth in shock. Pieces from the pink monsters flew everywhere and fell on the red-haired swordsman. Finally, the king was finished. He jumped to the player and praised him for being able to create 1,000 pink monsters. Lu Ajeng replied that he couldn't stand by while being attacked. He received a notification that he had completed the quest and joined the group. Finally, there were 3 traveling companions standing with the king. The players were about to go to another beach in search of traveling companions, for one was still lost as well. The mage waved a leaf at the king and offered him a rest. The boy offered the king some juicy fruit in gratitude. Suddenly an alert appeared. It said that the time of the test had come to an end. There would be a tally of points. Those with the least points would have to leave the island. The magician was startled. The boy was also dumbfounded and hid behind the mage's back. The blue-eyed boy Hua Huan received 15 points for the task. He was very glad that he had gotten through this mission at all. He tentatively held his weapon in his hands, was embarrassed by his score. The red-haired warrior Lu Ajeng also received 15 points, which the latter was dissatisfied with since there were more enemies. The system replied that swinging his sword was useless and didn't produce any results, although he had created a whole 100 slugs. Mage CG Yuan also got 15 points. They were discussing this victory with the king. Just then, the system added another 3 points to his score. The king and the mage decided that this was what he got for serving as a decoy. The mage's total number of points became 18. Wang Yuan received 15 points. And then the battle counter started spinning frantically, awarding him new points. His cool silhouette was calm and focused. He was holding a dagger in his hands, his hair fluttering in the wind. Remnants of slime flew around. Wang Yuan stood in a cool pose, red lines streaking behind his back. These lines were the king himself as he lightningly destroyed the pink monsters. The battle score counter was constantly changing, increasing in a big way. The system triggered memories of past battles, where the king was very fast. He was rushing, and his red eyes were fiercely looking at the pink monsters. In the end, the system counted the total number of points of player Wang Yuan. For all the battles came out to be 1035 points. The red eyes of the king looked at the blue screen, where the final result was displayed. The total number of total points of player Wang Yuan in the first stage was 1050 points. The system notified all the players that the king had taken the lead among the players. He had not expected this from himself. He was astonished in a pleasant way. Wang Yuan grinned. He was very proud of his result and was expecting praise. He was proud of his result and tried to hide from the players that he wasn't as happy about it as he actually was. To them, he told them that the system didn't have to notify everyone so pathetically. His traveling companion stood beside him. The mage was congratulating him, so happy that he stuck his tongue out in a shout. The boy looked on in admiration. The warrior was jealous of the king, so he said he was just lucky. The system announced that 15 points were needed to advance to the next stage. That's how many they all had. The mage was very happy for the king, jumping around him, pointing his fingers up, and in general, praising non-stop. The king was pleased himself. That's why he rubbed the boy's hair with pleasure. The warrior smiled looking at them and thought they were pretty close. All the players were cheering. The mage was giving the king a thumbs up. The king was embarrassed and overjoyed. Suddenly a message appeared on their blue system notification saying that those who didn't get the right amount of points would be removed from the island. The rest had to choose whether to leave or stay. Everyone looked carefully at their notifications. On the blue screen, it was written that the beach area would be closed in 2 minutes, and the players had to decide where they wanted to go. All the players were nervous. They frantically searched for the forest, because in 2 minutes, the way there would be closed. But the red-haired player was in a different mood. He was thinking about something while standing by a tree. The child was swiveling his head around looking for a path they should have all taken to go into the forest. The red-haired warrior, Luo Zheng, tapped himself on his armor and told everyone that they could now leave the game. The warrior rejoiced at this message. Hooray! It seems the players can now quit the game. It was very timely, as Luo Zheng already had plans for this evening. He confidently packed his things and had already turned around towards the beach. A smile shone on his face. All the players looked at Luo Zheng like a fool because he was about to walk towards the beach. When he noticed their questioning looks, the warrior tried to explain to them that he was about to leave the game. He didn't understand what was wrong, why they were hesitant. The mage gritted his teeth and tensed. He didn't think it was that simple. He remembered anime with similar plots for some reason, and in general, everything that happened in the game was unexplainable. Shi Ji Yuan had once watched a similar anime. He didn't think that the participants would be able to get out so easily. Especially in the game, very strange things were happening. For example, the fact that all the participants had become similar to themselves from the real world, which couldn't help but be frightening. The mage thought to himself that Luo Zheng really wants to get out of the game, and maybe he should be pushed into this decision. Maybe it could be that simple, especially since the warrior himself is asking to do it. After all, it's just a game anyway, and there might be mistakes. Luo Zheng was convinced by the mage's words. There was a real chance that it was all a bug in the game, and he could safely go out into the real world. In any case, it was possible to give it a try. Magician Shi Ji Yuan began to persuade the warrior to stay, and promised to meet him next time and play together. Luo Zheng stood and listened to the explanation. The magician told him to try it, if it really works. The magician didn't wait long, but pushed the warrior towards the beach. Luo Zheng began to hesitantly agree, under the magician's pressure. He said that he would give it a try. He was pushed towards the beach. Luo Zheng uncertainly scratched his head, but still decided to go. Luo Zheng walked away to the beach and waved to his former traveling companions. He told them that he really liked them, and it was a pleasure to play with them. The magician was happy to say goodbye to him, but here the king and the boy were not happy. They doubted the success of this venture, and they were silent. The king was nervous. He didn't want to force the player to stay in the game, but he was worried that this method wouldn't work. Could the way out of the game look like this? And wasn't it a one-way path? While the players were pondering the possible problems or successes of this mission, a terrifying glowing funnel opened up in the sky above them, with lightning bolts coming from it. All the players flinched and looked up. There were loud sounds, and a monster appeared from that funnel. A huge dragon appeared in front of swordsman Luo Zheng. It was so big that an ordinary person could easily fit into its shining eye. So large and majestic was the monster. Its eyes shone with blue fire and were brighter than the sun. A monster of unimaginable size flew towards the beach. The system showed that this monster's name was Island Scavenger. The notice the players had was that the beach area would be closed. All locations would be removed, as well as anyone who chose to stay on the beach. The monster's shadow covered the red-haired warrior. Luo Zheng froze in amazement. He saw the characteristics of the Island Scavenger. Its strength exceeded 9999999, and all the other characteristics were hidden. But no one doubted that they clearly exceeded the characteristics of all the characters combined. The system alerted the players. 5 seconds left to think. The mage was terrified. The system wrote that the scavenger would destroy everything in its path. He screamed, sweat was pouring down his face, and snot was dripping from his nose. The system alerted the players faster and faster. When there were 4 seconds left to make a decision, the little player trembled and tried to run away as far as possible. Luo Zheng drew his sword, intending to defend himself. His hands were trembling the same way his sword was trembling. He looked towards the trash monster and tried to convince himself that this was a way to unlog himself. He repeated it to himself like a mantra. The system alerted that there were 3 seconds left to go. King clenched his hand into a fist. He yelled that there was definitely something wrong here. The system wouldn't send a bloodthirsty monster to just quit the game. This was all more like a punishment and a loss for the player. The king activated his skill and threw Luo Zheng his scarf to get him out of the scavenger's clutches. He activated his secret skill, increasing his strength to 9, but at the same time, the strength was reduced by dexterity. The king shouted Luo Zheng's name loudly and asked him to grab on. Luo Zheng looked down at his body. He saw the king's red ribbon wrapped around his body. It was painful as the ribbon struck with force. The swordsman couldn't see what the others were doing, and certainly didn't see the king rushing to his aid. When there were 0 seconds left, the swordsman turned around in surprise and looked towards his comrades. There was fear in his eyes. A drop of sweat was running down his face. It was obvious that he was not sure of his decision. And then there was a huge explosion. The players were thrown away by the blast wave, so they couldn't see each other. The system notified the participants that the first stage was successful. It invited all participants to continue the journey. There were just under 70 hours left. The mage and the boy were left alone. They looked in the direction where the beach used to be. They were terrified of what had happened and had barely survived such a fall. There was still dust everywhere from the explosion that had happened. They didn't speak to each other, only looking at the abyss. Shiji Yuan was very nervous and blamed himself for persuading the warrior to stay on the island. He didn't do anything to harm him. He just wanted to test the capabilities of the system. The mage lost sight of the king. He wondered if Wan Yuan couldn't throw the dagger and thus save himself and get out of the jaws of the beast. The mage and the boy stood on the edge of the cliff, where only 5 seconds ago they had seen the king and the warrior. Just a few meters away from them was not a whole piece of the island, and just recently there was a whole beach. The worst part was that they didn't see the king and warrior beside them. Shiji Yuan stood on the edge of the cliff and was about to cry, when suddenly something behind his back startled him. When he turned around, he saw the king, who was holding the frightened warrior in his arms, landed. They landed with such force that the ground beneath their feet trembled. The mage was happy to see the king alive again, for without his help, they would not have been able to pass the tests. The king smiled at him and told him that they shouldn't have been so worried, as the king had everything under control and they were fine. But at the same time, the king looked at Luo Zheng, who was writhing in pain and had injured his ribs when he had rescued him from the monster. The king was embarrassed by the situation. He nervously apologized and scratched the back of his head. A drop of sweat was running down his face. He apologized for hurting and harming the player, but in his defense, the king said that the situation required emergency measures. The king ran after Luo Zheng, ready to jump after him into the jaws of the trash monster at any moment. The swordsman was terrified. He didn't understand what was happening or how he could escape. The king threw his red scarf that encircled the young man's body and yanked him towards him. When the king grabbed the player, his damage level was doubled, but his health was in the minus position. The system notified that the king was in a peaceful location, and if he harmed another player for the third time, he would face imminent punishment from the referee. Worried about the player's condition and health, the king offered a health potion to the red-haired young man. The potion was a small corked vial with a blue liquid splashing around in it. Luo Zheng was still angry and dissatisfied, so he didn't even look at the king. The king stood and held the blue vial with the restorative potion in his hands. Luo Zheng asked them if they thought he was a toy to test the game's capabilities. He didn't mind practicing with the players, and Luo Zheng was also grateful to them for helping and saving him. Luo Zheng was very displeased and confused. He was still sitting on the ground. The red-haired man held his head and said that he was grateful to them, but he had an important meeting scheduled for the evening that he couldn't miss, so why were they not letting him out of the game?